Today's story has everything. Illegal vehicle modifications, African warlords, and at the end of it, we're gonna bust the Mythbusters. First, let me pose a hypothetical to you. You messed up, bud. You're stuck in the Saharan Desert. The car you've been bebopping around in is broken on the side of a remote rocky trail. You're 20 miles from the nearest town, and there's a solar death ray above your head trying to shorten your life expectancy by the minute. You only eat pickle on this turd sandwich? You came loaded for bear, bud. You got 10 days worth of food and water, 400 miles worth of fuel for your now bricked car, and your handy box of hand tools. It's decision time. What are you gonna do? You gonna play the part of a good Boy Scout, sit tight, take refuge in the car, wait for rescue, hope it happens within the 10 days worth of food and water you got? Or are you gonna take option B, leave the relative safety of a broken down car in the middle of the desert and start hucking it the 20 miles through said desert back to safety? Not really great options, but without the use of a cell phone radio or carrier pigeon, those are the options available to you. Right? Well, not if Emile LeRay has anything to say about it. If the story of his 1993 escape from these exact circumstances is to be believed, not only was there a third option, but according to LeRay himself, it was the only option that allowed him to leave that desert alive. See, not only was Emile a tinkerer, but he was intimately familiar with his vehicle. Not in like a weird way, like that guy who tried to marry his Mustang, he just really knew how the car was put together and he understood all the engineering that was involved. So what he reckoned he could do in the middle of a scorching sandbox with nothing but hand tools was to re-engineer his broken Citroen 2CV and hammer and beat it into submission to try to create a Mad Max motorcycle that he could motor right out of the desert. And that's exactly what he did. We've got interviews with the man, pictures and videos of the machine, and half a library worth of sources retelling the exploits of the dumbass Frenchman who got himself stuck in the Saharan Desert, but somehow engineered his way out of the mess. But there's a problem with this story. The problem is that a lot of people don't believe it. They throw shade at it. Everybody, including the Mythbusters, question the validity of the tale being told. The tale that this man built this motorcycle in the desert and rode it to safety. And that's one of the things that drew me to this story. How in the world are the Mythbusters questioning this story when I'm looking at a YouTube video right here with some French mad scientist Doc Brown looking mother standing next to a steampunk dirt bike that clearly corroborates his story? Now we're going to explain what the Mythbusters missed and how they got this myth wrong, but the other aspect that drew me to this story is just the engineering of the whole thing. How exactly did this man repurpose various car parts and make it into a rideable motorcycle? But first, the skepticism. Is there a credible argument to suggest that this man did not build this bike in the desert, or possibly at all? No, to be blunt, he did. What, are you still here? Alright, fine, I'll explain it. The crown of blame can be placed on the heads of many different lazy reporters who didn't really care about the story of Emile LeRay past its curb appeal as a feel-good story to just sort of fill up space.
The kind of thing an automotive or engineering channel with a robot voice does a story on.
Each story is just a fruit pie of cherry-picked facts with the rest of the details beaten and whipped into a delightfully sweet topping to fit over their feel-good story. I, on the other hand, am less burdened with the desire to make you feel warm and fuzzy about the fuck-ups of a French electrician in the desert in 1993. I just want to know how he built the darn thing. Now we're gonna do this thing, we're gonna do it right, and that means y'all are gonna have to sit through a little bit of context. I'm sorry, not my rules. Get some coffee first. But you need to understand, being trapped in the Saharan Desert in 1993 in Morocco was dangerous. It's not just the sun, the sand, and the camel stampedes. Anybody in that particular area of the world was going to be dealing with Moroccan soldiers, separatists, revolutionaries, and desert bandits on top of the normal things in the desert that want to take you off the census. And I cannot emphasize enough how important this context is to the story. It sets up the whole reason Emile has to make the decisions that he does, and most of the stories that cover it just sort of front-side board slide right over this detail. For anybody wondering, Morocco is absolutely nothing like the two-part Office Christmas special made it seem. Morocco in 1993 is effed. Not more than the usual level of effed for Africa, but definitely the usual level of effed for Africa. And in this case, the human rights violations are being doled out by a man named King Hassan II and his military. Long story short, King Hassan II is losing grip on his rule after decades and decades of African warlord type stuff. And various separatist and revolutionary groups are popping up to try to affect change. Most notably, I think they wanted a new constitution, or maybe it was going to be their first constitution. Either way, I would recommend. Those things are great. As a result, tensions in the country are higher than Willie Nelson on an airplane. The military's everywhere. There are checkpoints being set up to limit the movement of citizens, and basically Morocco in 1993 is under martial law. Soldiers everywhere. You have to answer all kinds of questions if you want to do anything. kind of a terrible time being had by all. And it is this Morocco which Emile LeRay and his 1967 Citroen 2CV enter. The goal was to Kerouac it from Tonton, 400 miles through the Saharan Desert over roads, to Zafora, a trip that apparently Emile LeRay had made no less than 10 times before. I guess in addition to being a professional electrician and a hobbyist tinkerer, he also liked to use his 2CV like a Willys Jeep, which we're gonna go into the 2CV more later, but it was not a Willys Jeep. Early context, it's a two-wheel drive post-war econo box made by the French. Not only that, but Emile LeRay had the SRT package on his particular Citroen 2CV because it had the twin-cylinder engine instead of the single-cylinder engine some of them got. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We haven't even started our story yet. Having completed this trip several times before, Emile LeRay knew what it would take to make it 400 miles through the desert without needing an O'Reilly's or a Wawa. As mentioned, he had 10 days worth of food and water. I looked for exactly what 10 days of food entailed. I very much want to know what a 90s Franco Sparky packs for a 10-day trip through the desert. Couldn't find it. I know personally I'd probably bring beans, potted meat. You know, like the Underwood stuff. Oh man, deviled ham. Emile also has enough fuel for the trip and his trusty box of hand tools. We'll try to figure out exactly what was in that box later. He sets off from Tonton and almost immediately is stopped at one of Hassan's checkpoints. The soldiers at the checkpoint take a look at this Frenchman, they take a look at the car, the inordinate amount of supplies, and they promptly end Emile's big Saharan adventure. They tell him, you're going back to Tonton and you're gonna stay there. Presumably they also instructed him to stop trying to vacation in active African war zones, but I'm not sure. And here's where Emile shows exactly how French he really is. He smiles to the soldiers and then promptly resists. He turns his little clown car back towards Tonton, and as soon as he's out of sight of the checkpoint, he starts looking for what he calls a shortcut. Now, it's not clear if this is like a desert trail or just a break in the severely rocky terrain, but either way, when Emile finds what he's looking for, he left turns that Citroen away from the checkpoint, away from Tonton, off the road, and into the Saharan Desert.
Hey, seriously, is this safe?
Now, just because the Citroen 2CV is a two-wheel drive post-war econo box, it does not mean it was not uniquely suited for this kind of off-road use. Thanks to a light, compact build and a very unique suspension, which we'll cover in the build portion of this video, the 2CV had a reputation for being surprisingly spry over moderate terrain. Not quite your mom's 4Runner, but better than your average unicycle. Now, that build-up notwithstanding, LeRay makes it less than 10% of the original distance he intended to cover before physics enters the chat. LeRay finds a significantly large rock with one of the 2CV's front steer tires and promptly destroys it. The wheel and some part of his suspension, which was completely essential. What we need to know here is that the car's foobar, and it appears Emile is SOL. So we return to our original hypothetical, laden now with the burden of information. Now, Emile knew exactly how dangerous the desert sun and sand could be, but he feared earthly foes a bit more than the elements. LeRay knew that if he stayed put in his 2CV and just waited out his food supply until somebody found him, it was gonna be soldiers, possibly the same soldiers he had circumvented oh so recently that found him. Given the conditions in the country, there's not a lot of people just jagging through the desert. Additionally, if he starts walking back to Tonton, it's going to be several days in the desert without the shelter of the car, and ultimately he fears it'll be the exact same soldiers that he feared from Situation 1 that would find him if he started walking, because again, the only people patrolling out in the desert right now are King Hassan's soldiers. So it's at this point, being in a state of what he describes as survival mode, that LeRay comes to believe that his best chance for survival is to return back to Tonton on a motorcycle of his own design, sourced only with parts from his broken 2CV and whatever ingenuity he can muster, sitting there on the hot side of Muhammad's barbecue grill. During the first night in the desert, Emile holes up in his disappointingly stationary 2CV and begins to brainstorm on the mammoth project ahead of him. He assesses all the things he has, all the things he doesn't have, and what it's going to take to get this motorcycle built. During that first night, he comes up with an estimate of 3 days. Emile thinks it'll take 3 days to re-engineer his broken 2CV into a working motorcycle. He should be in Tonton by the 4th night. Greetings, friends. Don't be afraid. It's just Future Doug coming to you from the editing table to add a little bit of clarity that I glossed over or otherwise missed on the first go-around. As we go through this story, remember that LeRay honestly believed this whole ordeal was going to take 3 days. And yes, since I know you're wondering, I do edit my videos in the middle of the New Jersey woods. Even though he has 10 days worth of supplies, being in what he again describes as survival mode, he makes the decision to ration his food and water to try to extend that 10 days, just in case. Spoiler alert, super good idea, Emile. Now it would be impossible to continue this story any further and do it any more justice than those who have traipsed the ground before me without discussing in detail the Citroen 2CV. Clown car in looks? Definitely. But as you're soon going to realize, the real main character of this story is the Citroen 2CV. Emile? Merely a facilitator. Before we can go into depth on the 2CV, one more brief sojourn, I promise, is necessary into French car culture. This video is all over the map, but I promise it all comes back together. You see, the French don't experience cars the way the rest of the people on this big blue beautiful marble of ours do. In most countries, take the United States, cars are celebrated as a status symbol. There's a direct correlation between the sticker price on your car and how well your bank account's doing. Shout out to everybody driving an 03 Altima with 4 different colored doors. I feel your pain. And because we celebrate cars as a status symbol, chances are if you see somebody with a nicer car than you, hey bud, they're doing better than you in life. Probably just a better person all around. Either that, or they are leveraged to the hilt and about to lose their housing so that their coworkers can see them roll up in a Hellcat every day. The point is, that wouldn't happen in France. Why? The French don't care. They don't care about cars. Cars are just transportation. They're something not to be taken too seriously. Kind of the way sane adults are supposed to look at bicycles. It's with this MO that the Citroen 2CV goes into the design phase in the early 30s at Citroen in France. Anybody even casually familiar with European history knows that the 1930s is a bad time to be starting anything in Europe. And in fact, production on the Citroen 2CV is actually put off until after American boots hit French sand. Funny story, the designers at Citroen actually walled off the prototypes for what was at that point a cutting-edge miracle of modern design behind a false brick wall in their factory so that it wouldn't fall into DOS hands, if you know what I mean. And I tried so hard to make like an Anne Frank automotive joke, but just couldn't find one. This works, and as post-war France ramps up production on various things, in 1948, Citroen puts the 2CV into production, and it is an immediate success. This car is adored for its reputation as being a reliable, rugged little runabout, and it is dastardly easy to work on. One man with hand tools can completely assemble or disassemble this entire car in the time it takes my beloved Bears to blow a third quarter lead. And it's for this reason that for the rest of the video I'm going to be making the case that Citroen picking a 2CV over a Beetle or some kind of Peugeot or Renault or literally any other car is the one detail this entire story hinges on. Had to be a 2CV. That makes the 2CV the main character. Because without the 2CV, LeRay can't build the motorcycle, and then his story is just a story of a guy who walked 20 miles through the Saharan Desert. Doesn't sound fun, definitely an impressive feat, but not one anyone's gonna make YouTube videos about. So back to the 2CV. It is designed in the body-on-frame, front-engine, front-wheel drive configuration. The body is light and easily removed from the frame, something you can see in the MYTHBUSTERS episodes, which are currently only available in several segments on YouTube. This specific episode is not available on any of the streaming services. I will leave links down below if I remember. Now, most of the car is your average post-war economy car, but the suspension is where the real magic happens. This thing's so stupidly simple and French that it absolutely saves Emile's dumb butt in the desert in 1993. Instead of using any conventional suspension components, leaf springs, coil springs, torsion bars, doesn't use any of that. What the car uses is front and rear trailing arms, these kind of horn looking things that you see there, and they are connected to a shared oil damper, one on each side. And it gives the 2CV its unique handling characteristics. You see, by tying the suspension of the front and rear wheel together on each side through a shared oil damper, when one wheel dips, it causes the corresponding wheel to raise. In this way, the 2CV is incredibly agile at articulating over different obstacles, which is why LeRay is able to take this thing through the desert like it's some kind of Jeep. Additionally, everything else on the car is very simple. As mentioned, it's got either a single or dual cylinder air-cooled engine, it's got a very simple manual transmission, and not much else. Alright, real quick, before we can get into the build, exactly how LeRay accomplished this, which is what I wanted to know and how I got tangled up in this story, first we need to discuss the damage. Now, they discuss him damaging beyond repair a wheel by hitting a rock. I think we can clearly understand what that is. Probably a steel wheel, and I'm sure it just crumpled when it impacted the wheel. Now, it also talks about breaking an axle, which is not as descriptive as you might think, because this isn't a solid axle vehicle. What it's got are those leading arms, like I said, and then it's got axle shafts, which would come from the transmission to the wheel hub. Now, did he damage one of the axle shafts, or did he damage one of those leading control arms? I think it's probably one of the leading arms that crumpled backwards with the impact that destroyed the wheel, but we're not exactly sure, and that does affect how he would go forward. I feel like if it was just the axle, there may have been some way he could have kept this car moving, but without a way to locate that other hub, there's nothing he could do. Hey friends, me again. A lot of you are going to have questions like, where did all these pictures come from? Well, LeRay had a camera, obviously, and in fact, in one of the pictures, you can actually see him holding the remote button and the wire. I don't know if it's going to show up when I put the video on the YouTube thing, but he had a camera and he documented his process. All right, back to Pass Doug. So he grabs his handy box of tools and he turns on the car. As already mentioned, it's super easy to pull the body off of a 2CV. So that's the first thing he does. He sets it aside. That is now his little house while he's working on this project. Now the tools he has with him are never clearly laid out, and I looked everywhere. I read every interview, every crappy retelling of this story, every half-assed description of what went on. There's a picture of him holding a hacksaw, and he talks about a hacksaw. He also talks about having a file and a punch for blashing holes through metal where he needed to put a screw. It doesn't specifically talk about wrenches, a hammer, screwdrivers, but I just can't imagine a guy who is a hobbyist tinkerer not at least having that stuff with him. So he's got the body off the 2CV, and if you're looking at the chassis in the picture and you look at the bike he built, you can start to see how he modified the chassis. He flipped it around and then he cut most of it off the front and the back. And the reason he flipped it around is that cutout where it looks like maybe the fuel tank went, or maybe it was just area for the trunk in the back of the chassis, that void now creates clearance for the now steer tire. He also cuts off most of one side of the chassis, and that's illustrated if you look at the bike. There's still an oil damper and all the bracketry and everything mounted on one side, and in fact he uses the front suspension rod from that oil damper system to locate the front wheel. The back wheel is just sort of resting there. We'll talk about that in a second. Additionally, those horn-like leading and trailing arms, which as you can see from the picture of the chassis, are used to push the wheels out away from the chassis and locate them in the fender area of the body. LeRay takes those and he flips them around. So now they're bringing the wheels inside the chassis, and in that way he's able to get that sort of single wheel track with mass on both sides that a normal motorcycle would have. After that, he removes the engine and the transmission and he flips them around. And this is another reason it had to be a 2CV. The transmission on the 2CV has this big output shaft drum. So that's directly driven from the transmission, which is being turned by the motor. What LeRay figures out he can do is mount the engine and transmission in such a way that that friction wheel is laying on the rear tire. Right? And that rear tire is not actually suspended by anything but the motor. So all the gravity that's pushing the bike down is pushing that output shaft wheel onto the back tire and driving it. The only problem is the back tire is going to spin the opposite direction as the output shaft. So he has to run the thing in reverse, which means reverse is his only forward gear. Anybody who's ever ridden a motorcycle knows they are devilishly unstable at low speeds. It's not until you get going that you really have enough momentum to do whatever you want to do. So only having one forward gear is kind of going to be a problem. So now he's got a suspension that looks like a motorcycle. He's got a way to propel this thing forward. He just needs to kind of button up loose ends. And I say just like it's easy, but the 3 days he expected this to take, it actually takes 12. So really good thing he started rationing his food. Could you imagine spending 12 days in the desert doing nothing but banging on a car with hand tools? Anyway, he creates a seat for the thing out of a piece of his rear bumper, which he wraps in foam and tape. He's also able to make a kickstand from the filler neck. You can see the whole bike's actually a little bit off center, and on one side is mounted the battery and the fuel tank. Additionally, he's able to use a lot of the original steering linkage and a long tiller bar with the handle from the jack kind of used as handlebars. And I mean, it's janky, but it's S tier as far as ingenuity in the desert go. And those are really all the basics to the bike he built. It's very simple, and it's worth noting that it didn't have any brakes. I don't know if LeRay didn't think he needed them, or if he just couldn't figure out a way to make them work, or if he didn't have time to make them work. I don't know, but it didn't have brakes. Oh, you guys again? What do you want to know this time? Oh yeah, a little more clarity on the bike. So that's what LeRay built in its entirety. It has a motor, it's got wheels, it's got steering. That's about it. While we're discussing builds, the MYTHBUSTERS actually built 2 bikes. In the episode, when they first go into the desert with their 2CV, they kind of engineer their own version of LeRay's bikes. Notable differences are the engine is all the way in the back and the rear tire is not flipped under, it's flipped towards the back, so the whole bike is a lot longer. The balance is a little different, and this version of the bike does have brakes, but it requires 2 riders to operate. You got Jamie in the front, wiggling the steering wheel, and I guess doing the throttle, and then Jamie's sitting reverse cowgirl on the back of the darn thing doing the clutch and the brakes. This is not how LeRay built his bike. They failed to get that bike going with any kind of reliability. They could ride it for a second and then the thing would fall over and it'd send them flying off. Then they head back to M5, their home base thing, and they rebuild the bike in LeRay's vision. Now they don't specifically explain how, but they do note that this version of the bike is to the original creator's specs. The only problem with their bike is that they tested it both in the desert and at that Alameda bomb range airport. What was that big open space they always did all that testing at? After 2 or 3 seconds on it, both Adam and Jamie, who we know from other episodes are both avid motorcycle riders, they couldn't make it work. Ultimately, they busted the myth based on the fact that they couldn't ride it for more than a second or two, even though they'd followed Emile LeRay's plans. It appears to be to the letter. Like I said, we'll talk about the Mythbusters more later. Let's get back to our doofy Frenchman in the desert. Now the test drive went exactly as can be expected, considering the thing steers like the Bismarck, is as stable as a shopping bag full of soup, and is continuously rolling coal into the face of the rider as it's operating. Emile gets on, gives it a bit of gas, the bike lurches, jumps, and immediately falls directly on LeRay. All 400 pounds of it, I assume sending foie gras directly into his tighty whities, because if he breaks an arm or a leg out there, this whole Hell's Angel plan is getting fiddle-faddle, straight out of doable, and it's probably going to spell the end of Emile's adventure and his life. Somehow though, he's able to get the bike off of him, and he spends the remainder of that 12th night tinkering and modifying, trying to find some way to turn this cursed beast into a more tame, rideable motorcycle. The next morning, LeRay gathers up the rest of his water, a whole ½ liter he had left, finished that bike just in time, and he heads off back to Tauntaun. So LeRay's bebopping down the road, or the desert trail, or whatever we decided it was. Honestly, from the pictures, it kind of just looks like he was jagging through the desert, but what you need to know is it was rough riding for my man Emile on his Perrier Panhead because of all the aforementioned things. He couldn't get enough speed to overcome the poor balance, and additionally, he's still riding in the same unpredictable rocky terrain that claimed his 2CV just 12 days ago. After an entire day of trying to hold on to the mechanical equivalent of a drunken cheetah, LeRay stops for the night, sets up camp with a makeshift tent, and prepares to sleep it off for day 2 of riding. I tried to determine exactly how far he made it from camp or back towards Tauntaun, but it's never specified, probably because nobody knows. I looked up what the top reverse speed was on a 2CV and got mixed answers. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter because for a third time, Emile's adventure is going to be interrupted. He is not making it back the way he planned. Do you recall earlier in the video when we were discussing the hypothetical options and LeRay's fear that it would in fact be the soldiers, either the ones he just circumvented or different angry African soldiers, that found him? At this point, when it looks like LeRay finally has a way to make it back to Tauntaun without anyone ever figuring out about his disobedience, in the middle of the night, in his camp, in his makeshift tent, he is located by a bunch of Moroccan soldiers. Soldiers are immediately suspicious of LeRay, the camp, the crazy contraption he's riding, and his whole excuse for being out there. In fact, it wasn't until he convinces the soldiers to follow him back to the build/crash site that he's finally able to stop admiring the rifling down the soldiers' barrels. So with Desert Grave and imprisonment off the table for now, the soldiers agree to follow LeRay as he rides his Desert Ducati back to Tauntaun. But the term rides really needs to be prefaced with attempted to ride, because even though this thing is an engineering miracle based on the circumstances of its creation, it's still an awful motorcycle, and the terrain is absolutely impossible. So after a short amount of time of these soldiers watching this guy almost die every 20 seconds flying off this crazy bike, they call another truck and they just tow Frankenstein and his monster back to Tauntaun. Now this is the funniest part of this story. You might assume LeRay would receive some level of compassion or leniency for the whole ordeal he'd just been through, but you would be oh so wrong. You see, LeRay had actually fixed the license plate from his Citroen to the back of the motorcycle, a step I would not have thought to take. The problem was that license plate was registered to a 1967 Citroen 2CV, not to an unrecognizable bastard cycle. On returning to Tauntaun, the bike is impounded and LeRay is fined for operating an unregistered vehicle. It appears that the fine was for about 450 euros, which is about 879 euros adjusted for 2025, which is about $1,020. That exchange rate really hurts. What the hell happened, man? We used to be a country. So LeRay returns to France without his East African coast chopper, but returns 1 month later in another 2CV, of course, to pick up the bike and bring it back to France. When he returns, he continues to live the quiet life of a professional electrician and hobbyist tinkerer. He continues messing around with 2CVs. He builds a boat out of one. There's a video about it on the Great Big Move. He even built a table saw out of one of them, which I would have thought was a misprint or a joke, but it's in the video and you can tell it's made out of car parts. Sparkies really are a weird breed. So on a scale from moon landing to Kennedy, where does this story fall on the likely it happened as told scale? Well, it exists as some kind of Schrodinger's tale, somehow clearly true and verifiable, but also busted by one of the most respected duos to ever tackle the veracity of random lore. And while I respect the Mythbusters oh so much, being a millennial, I absolutely grew up with Adam and Jamie, I can see where the miscommunication was and how they ultimately busted a myth that was true. You see, what Adam and Jamie set out to do was prove whether or not LeRay had created a rideable motorcycle, not any motorcycle at all. In fact, their motorcycle that they built in the episode, as mentioned, was pretty much identical to LeRay's. It's very clear they had pictures and materials about the bike he built when they were building theirs. The only problem is when it came time to ride it, neither Adam or Jamie could get enough seat time on this thing to actually call it confirmed. They would wreck it or roll it over or crash it or have to jump off relatively quickly. So their conclusion was if they built the bike the same as LeRay and they couldn't ride it, well, the story's busted. He did not build a rideable motorcycle. The only problem with that is they're missing the spirit of LeRay's experience. LeRay didn't have the benefit of calling it too dangerous to proceed, playing the busted buffer, and then heading off to the craft services table. He had one thing on his to-do list for that day: ride this hog back to Tauntaun. So he kept at it. Every time he fell off, he got back up, got back on it again. What was he gonna do? He just spent 12 days building this thing. Even if it was unrideable, which I think is confirmed by the fact that the soldiers finally just took pity on him and towed the darn thing back, he still built it and wrote it. Kind of a contradiction. It was unrideable, but he wrote it, but that's where we're at with it. And aside from the Mythbusters discrepancy, as mentioned, it's really just a cavalcade of lazy reporting and cherry picking of facts by various pages looking to just do a quick feel-good story that have led to so many extra questions around what should be a relatively cut and dry story. Alrighty friends, I'll take it from here. That is the story of Emile LeRay, the situation he got himself into, the motorcycle that he built to get himself out, and how he ultimately did make it out of the desert. Not as originally planned, or secondarily planned, or by his tertiary plan, but he was dragged out by those same soldiers that he feared so much in the beginning. So really, this is a story of redemption for the soldiers. Or a story of brilliant engineering, though he bike was unrideable. It's a story about the testament of the unbreakable spirit of the human will, mind. You know what? Come up with your own snappy summary of what you think this story's about and leave it down there in the squawk boxes. The point is, we're done here. We know LeRay built the bike. We know he built it in the desert. We know it was rideable or not rideable. I don't know. The real question is, what if the soldiers hadn't found him? How long would it have taken him to make it back to Tauntaun? Or would he ended up dead on the side of the road, crushed underneath his 400 pounds of twisted steel and sex appeal? Can't answer that question, but regardless of the actual circumstances and what coulda, woulda, shoulda happened, the thing is darn cool, and it's an amazing story of what one man was able to do with hand tools and an in-depth knowledge of how a vehicle was put together. You enjoyed this story or the way I told it? I'm hoping to do more. This is actually the first video on this channel. Fun fact, at the time of recording, right now, as I'm sitting here, time of editing for that matter, still don't have a name for this channel. I just can't really land on anything, though I guess you guys know what I went with. How'd I do? For a while there I was kicking around that dirtbag from Jersey. I really hope I found something better than that. Just wish King Trout wasn't taken. That name is fire. Anyway, whatever this channel ends up being called, if you'd like to see more of what we're gonna do on it, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you liked this video, like the video. That's common sense. I'm thinking about doing Killdozer next. I know others have done it. There'll be people that do it after me, but I'd like to put my spin on it. Big fan of old Uncle Marv. Thanks so much for watching. Can't wait to see y'all in the next one.